Welcome to the Sky News Daily. Niall Paterson here in the podcast studio with some fresh data from the Office for National Statistics. Every month, the ONS tells us just how much money the government is borrowing, the amount of additional cash it requires on top of all the stuff it takes in taxes. Just a heads up, you might want a stiff drink on standby. So whilst you pour that, a reminder, we want to hear your views on this and indeed every story we cover. Sky News Daily at sky.uk is the email. You can stalk me on X and Insta as well, at Sky News Neil for that. But let's head back to those numbers because they take on even greater significance when you remember that Labour Chancellor Rachel Reeves has been warning the economy is on its backside. She's also been fond of pointing out what she describes as a £22 billion black hole in the nation's finances. We will discuss the politics of it all with our chief political correspondent a little later. But let's begin with our economics editor, Ed Conway. Ed, good to see you. Borrowing figures are out. What do they tell us?
I have not had my stiff drink yet, and I'm disappointed I haven't been offered one yet in this podcast. The interesting thing here, okay, is that there's this big picture, which is that Rachel Reeves has been going on about this dire inheritance that the government has. We had that whatever you want to call it, the black hole report, kind of a month or so ago. Since then, actually, a lot of the data, a lot of the numbers have been pretty good.
Yeah.
Inflation's stayed pretty low. The Bank of England's cutting interest rates. Gross domestic product, the best measure of how fast the economy is growing, is doing great. We are the fastest growing. Over the first 6 months of this year, we're the fastest growing economy in the G7.
Wow.
Last year, we were the second worst. Now we're the fastest. So a lot of people have looked at all of that and gone, well, hang on, it's not dire at all. Actually, the economy is doing great. It's a great inheritance. And what's interesting today is we've had a bit of the opposite evidence in terms of the data, because in the end, what does this come down to? It comes down to how good are the public finances, and we know the big picture, which is they're not that great right now. The national debt used to be, before the financial crisis, the national debt was 30-something% of GDP. It's now 100% of GDP. So we are massively in debt compared with where we were before. Obviously, there are understandable reasons why that happened. You had the financial crisis, you had the pandemic, all of these things, the energy price shock. So there's understandable reasons for that. But the public finances are not great right now, and interest rates are high, and that means you're paying more interest on the debt. So all of that stuff, I guess, is known. What I think is new is that looking through the numbers, when we talk about borrowing, all that, fundamentally, you're just working out how much is the government bringing in money and tax receipts, and then how much is it spending. And the difference between those two things is where the borrowing comes in. It's actually quite simple when you ignore the economists. But actually, if the economy was really going gangbusters, and those GDP numbers are better than the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, expected, then you'd kind of expect the tax receipts to be higher. So a note of caution, let's say, that maybe the economy is doing okay, but not quite as amazingly as you might have thought.
So how much are we borrowing?
They are actually spending even more than expected. And it's quite striking. We've only had 4 months so far of this fiscal year, so since April, in terms of the data. And in that period, the overspend is about £9 billion. And that's actually quite a lot. When you think that it's only kind of a third of the year, when you think that £9 billion just so happens to be the exact amount of headroom that the Chancellor has against her fiscal rules.
The safety net. The
safety net.
That governments tend to put in because, events, dear boy, that you just can't see coming.
Yeah, it's kind of a safety net. The point is, if it's going to keep those rules, based on where those public finances are right now, based on the amount that it's spending, across government, it's going to break them unless it does something. And
Sure.
The something is, I guess, we heard a bit of what that something is in that report from Rachel Reeves earlier this summer, but we'll hear much, much, much more about that in the budget. The budget's going to be all about, raising taxes, cutting spending, difficult decisions in inverted commas. I think it's a problem if you're just constantly borrowing to finance stuff that's just to keep things turning over. The theory, this golden rule should be you do most of your borrowing to invest for the future, okay? And so you're borrowing to build stuff. You're borrowing potentially to kind of make schools better, to make hospitals better.
To ensure growth in the future.
Exactly, and for future generations, because who is going to be paying for this? When you borrow, you're just passing that cost on to future generations. I think that's the issue, okay? How much of this borrowing is just to fund current spending? And the answer is rather a lot of it at the moment. This to me is a slightly depressing thing. Having said that, I do think, there's going to be all sorts of grim tidings in the budget. It's going to be very bad news. There will be more taxes. She'll be very she's got this expression of unhappiness, I think, in a lot of her recent announcements. There will be, I think, an unhappy Rachel Reeves on the 30th of October when she does the budget. What happens next? How soon does she come out with a kind of plan for growth? The question is, I think, how long do we have to wait for Rachel Reeves to set in motion some stuff, which is actually, I want to build this new kind of road or power plant or whatever it might be.
But let's just take a step back and look forward to the budget. So we've got significantly increased borrowing from this government. We've got significantly increased spending by this government. We're also going to be seeing cuts taking place in numerous government departments. Doesn't this all mean that come the time of the budget, we know what's going to happen? We are going to see even more borrowing and even more taxation.
Well, I mean, maybe if, yes, definitely more taxation. The whole point of the taxation is that you do less of the borrowing. I mean, that's the point. The economic purpose is to say, okay, we're just going to kind of set things up so that we can do a bit more spending later on. And I think if you do a bit of cutting now, then potentially there's an economic rationale to say you can do that. But then, I mean, the political thing is just as, if not more significant here, which is they can just blame everything on the Tories.
Well, can they when it comes to the borrowing? Was this borrowing from the last government, or is this borrowing that has taken place since Labour got into power, had a look at the books and decided to carry on with an awful lot of capital spending?
The majority of the extra borrowing that we're talking about today is from the last government. So we only have data for July, which obviously straddles that election period, and it's kind of more or less the same pattern. But the majority of this overshoot in spending, which is kind of what it is, that is from the last government. So you can definitely say this started with the Conservatives. What I think is more tenuous is to say that things have gone haywire and totally out of control, or that this was totally unexpected. Definitely, it is a bit striking how much higher that spending is than most would have thought.
Well, it lends some weight to Rachel Reeves' case, doesn't it?
It does lend some weight to it. I think that it's hard to make the case that this is the most dire economic inheritance that Chancellor's faced since the war. It's clearly not. There were times when things looked a lot worse. I mean, when George Osborne came in, we're still recovering from a financial crisis. There were still banks that needed to be nationalised. I mean, that we are clearly not in that period at the moment.
Yeah, but where was debt as a proportion of GDP back then?
Well, quite. I mean, debt was on its way up from that 40% level towards the kind of 70-80% that it ended up at after his tenancy. But if you look around the world, yes, the UK's economy is not doing that well at the moment, but maybe partly by dint of the fact that there is a new government that seems quite stable at the moment. The UK is being quite favoured at the moment. The pound has been strengthening, rather than kind of weakening, despite the fact that interest rates have been going down. People are looking at the UK stock market and starting to invest in it for the first time in a while. That's paradoxical. And interestingly, I think the next few weeks, the drumbeat that we'll probably hear a lot about from the government is this big investment conference they're putting on, where it's all about kind of encouraging people to come and put money into the UK. That's going to be the next big event, actually, before the budget. And they will want to talk about Britain being open. But part of the reason that people are willing to put money into Britain is not just because of the Labour government. It's because, there are long established reasons why the UK is an attractive place to do business. But yes, definitely, the debt is really high. The tax burden is higher than it has been, since the war, essentially. And all of these things add up, and they put pressure on households, and you're not getting as much of your money in your pocket, and we've just been through a terrible period of kind of inflation. So definitely things are not fantastic.
Sure,
but they're not terrible. I don't think it's I wouldn't call it dire. I'd just call it bad.
Ed, thanks very much indeed. And indeed, that is what we are looking at after the break, the perception and the politics. Jon Craig, our man in Westminster, will be here. Welcome back. Politicians often repeat themselves. They say the same thing time and again, over and over and over, all in an attempt to make it stick in your mind, to convince the public that their assertion is in fact truth. Which is why the Chancellor keeps repeating that the economy is crocked and that things are even worse than they'd predicted in opposition. Thing is she right? Our chief political correspondent, Jon Craig, is back on the podcast. Good to see you, Jon. I mean, look, this Labour mantra, the economy is in the toilet, it's even worse than we ever predicted. Do they think it is working, given, we've just had growth figures which suggest a rather rosier picture?
Well, they keep repeating these claims about what they're now calling a dire inheritance being left to them by the Tories. But Labour are not just talking about using that phrase about the economy. This week they've talked about a dire inheritance on border security. Earlier this week, Keir Starmer talked about a terrible inheritance on the prisons crisis. So it is a blame game, if you like, but my view is that it works for a start. It's all right in the first few weeks of a government, but the public are going to get tired of it and say, well, look, we elected you, sort it out. Now, they, of course, would argue that they are going to sort it out, although I noticed that on the border security and stopping the boats, they have admitted, not surprisingly, no quick fix on that one. Well, to be fair, there's no quick fix on the economy either. But the blame game is something we see from governments. For example, do you remember back in 2010 when David Cameron and George Osborne came in the coalition government? For ages, they kept on going on about how Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling crashed the economy.
Yep.
Incoming governments clearly think this works. But of course, if the recipe for sorting out these economic problems is big tax rises, the public won't like that. There's already been a really hostile reaction to Rachel Reeves saying she's going to means test the winter fuel payments to pensioners, with a lot of both opposition politicians claiming that it's going to hit millions of pensioners. Many Labour backbenchers are unhappy about that too. So we could be heading for a Halloween horror with that budget on the 30th of October.
We may well be, and I may well be stealing that line as well, John. But surely the problem for Labour is even more nuanced than that. That, you know, it is fine to say that the economy is absolutely stuffed, but this Labour government has increased spending. I just don't know how they can argue against the fact that borrowing more money seems like a pretty bad idea when they have made the decision to spend more money.
And of course, one of the most controversial things they've done in the last week or so is hand out whopping pay rises in the public sector. We've seen inflation-busting pay increases handed out to ASLEF train drivers. Now, the government argues, of course, that sorting out pay disputes in the National Health Service, on the transport network, is good for the economy. It helps the great growth crusade that Rachel Reeves keeps talking about. But, it's difficult to justify, you could argue, big pay hikes to public sector workers when the purse strings are very tight. Having said that, those borrowing figures, Neil, do rather bear out the government's claim about the dire inheritance, because, of course, they point to some of the borrowing earlier in the year, before the general election, not just the few weeks since the general election on July the 4th.
James Cleverly, and this goes back to the public sector pay deals, and it's a strong line. Labour has been beaten, has been broken by its union paymasters. We've seen stories in the papers backing that up, and I'm doing that in inverted commas, pointing out just how much money individual unions have been donating to individual members of the cabinet.
Well, first of all, on the question of trade unions supporting Labour candidates and the Labour Party in general, yes, during the election campaign, ASLEF did give £100,000 to the party. I think it was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, union donation. And yes, unions can contribute to Labour MPs, Labour candidates. They are the Labour Party, after all. I mean, I laughed out loud. You talk about the right-wing press when I saw a headline in the Daily Mail. Half of Labour MPs get money from trade unions. Well, slap my thigh. My goodness. I mean, the big surprise is that only half of them get money from trade unions. I have to admit,
I'm with you on that one.
And the other point also, just while we're on donations, I mean, I covered all this during the general election campaign. They got more money from their big millionaire donors, private donors, than they did from the trade unions. So that's, and the Tories, of course, went into a sulk because, of course, their big millionaire donors went on strike and stopped giving them money.
At the same time, we hear Labour figures talking about relaxing the rules around balloting, around union action. And I just don't understand when they seemingly are on a bit of a collision course with big business at the moment.
I think it's an exaggeration to say they're on collision course with big business. Obviously, big business leaders don't like the idea of more rights for workers and so on. to be fair to Labour, they went into the election campaign making absolutely no secret of the fact of what they were going to bring in what they call a new deal for workers, and cracking down on 0 hours contracts, all that sort of stuff. But what the government is clearly reckoning on is that if, as we've said as moments or two ago, what they want to do is sort out these industrial problems. For example, get the trains moving again, get junior doctors back to work, and also other public sector groups, and sort these disputes out, which, to be fair, have dragged on in some cases for 2 years. It was before I became a political correspondent, but there's a famous quote of Aneurin Bevan when he created the National Health Service, and he was asked, how did you pay off the doctors? And he said, I stuffed their mouths with gold. So Labour have done this before, and they clearly want to bring an end to all these strikes. Now, if there are strikes over the winter, if there is something like a winter of discontent, clearly that will have backfired. But obviously the government will be hoping to have better industrial relations, even if it does cost money.
Given that 1 in 7 of us don't think that tax rises are a good idea right now, how on earth does the Chancellor sell the tax rises that are coming down the pipeline in that budget?
Well, she has to say short-term pain for long-term gain, of course. That's all she can do, really. And of course, we'll hear more blaming of the Conservatives for what they call the dire inheritance. Yes, it's going to be unpopular. I mean, the winter fuel means testing is already massively unpopular. Then, of course, the other big unpopular thing which sparked a rebellion in Parliament in July is this controversial issue of the two-child cap on benefit payments. Whatever measures she brings in, Rachel Reeves, in the autumn on October the 30th, and that budget, the first budget, it's going to be tough. But there's a sort of there's an unwritten rule in politics. When you come in as a new government, if you've got to do tough stuff, do it quickly. Don't let it linger and fester to later on in the Parliament. Do the unpopular stuff early. And of course, they have got a massive majority. So they will get stuff through Parliament, even if some MPs do rebel. But they'll think twice about rebelling now if they're going to lose the Labour whip. So Rachel Reeves likes to be seen as an iron chancellor, a bit like Gordon Brown. So far, she's doing that. But of course, public sector pay rises, of course, have made people think, not so iron after all, perhaps.
Jon, many thanks. And that's your lot for today. Do let us know your thoughts at Sky News Neil on Twitter or Insta. You can email skynewsdaily@sky.uk. And if you subscribe to the podcast, you'll never miss an episode. We're back tomorrow.